just so that we have a recording of this so folks can watch it later on if they weren't able to attend live today. So welcome everyone to today's Survivor Circle session. My name is Becky Perkins. I'm the Survivor Support Specialist with Zero Abuse Project, and really excited to welcome you today. And this is our first time using Zoom webinars for Survivor Circle. So I'm very excited about that, and just would ask for your grace and patience if there are any features with it that aren't quite what we had anticipated. We will learn as we go. But just want to remind everyone that you're able to type into the chat, and everyone will be able to see it, our panelists as well as other attendees. If you would like to comment anonymously, I believe you have the ability to do that. There's an icon on the side of the chat that should enable you to do that. If not, my apologies. Again, we're still learning. Anyway, I'm happy that you're here today. Thanks so much for joining us, and I am thrilled as always to welcome two of my favorite people as co-presenters today to talk about the art of trauma journaling, Sarah Helms and Jamie Rosseland. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Becky. All right, I guess we're up. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So here we are, it's being shared. Give me a moment to get on the correct page. I am on the correct page. Amazing. Let me find the present button and click all the correct buttons. I did it. All the correct buttons work.
So nice when the technology works.
Yes. And Sarah, just so you know, I can't see any comments or anything. So if you would just bubble those up when you get a chance, that would be great. If you can see them.
I'm going to attempt to figure out how to be able to see them in real time as we're talking, but feel free to dive in and we'll figure that out as we go.
Okay. So this session is called The Art of Trauma Journaling. And it is hosted by myself, Jamie Rosseland, and my colleague, Dr. Sarah Helms. And today we're going to go over a few things. We will be just doing a quick recap of Sarah and I's story. We'll be talking about the mental health perspective of trauma journaling. We'll be talking about this concept of authentication, which is a word I have trouble pronouncing, but bear with me, guys. We'll also talk a little bit about Dadaism, which is a little bit surprised. It's not on the agenda, but it's there. We'll go over some examples of what trauma journaling can look like. And then if we have enough participation and engagement, we'll do a 6-word memoir together. And if not, this is being recorded, so anyone who views it later will be able to follow along in that process. And then we'll talk a little bit about blackout poetry, and then we're going to do a Q&A if we have any questions or comments at the end, which at that point I will close out sharing my screen and I'll be able to see all the comments. So that'll be great. Sarah, did I miss anything before we get into our story?
No, that sounds great. And I believe I have my screen set right now where if a chat pops up, I'll see a preview and I'll jump in. But if not, Becky, if you want to hop in and interrupt us at any point, if you're seeing comments that would be good for us to address as we're going through the presentation, that's good too.
Yes, I'll be happy to do that.
Thanks, Becky, the voice from above. All right. So yeah, so Sarah and I have done a Survivor Circle, at least two Survivor Circles together. And we usually share a little bit of our story, but for anyone who's not familiar with that, I met Sarah, I think back in 2016, 2017-ish. I'm not really sure. And I was first introduced to Sarah because she was recommended by another survivor as like a good therapist. And so I started, also, she was recommended as a good therapist after I had a not so great experience with a therapist who I will not say was either good or bad, but I had a pretty difficult experience with this person. So after my not so great experience, I attempted to trust again and met Sarah and was pleasantly surprised to find someone who I could connect with and could help me process through some of the experiences I had. And from there, after seeing Sarah for a while, I decided to apply at the agency that Sarah worked at. It was at the time what I thought was my dream job. It paid a salary that was incredible. And Sarah and I had to figure out what that was going to look like. For me to not just be in a therapist-client relationship with Sarah, but also what would it look like for me and Sarah to be in a client-colleague relationship? And so we managed that, and we won't get into, I guess, all the details of that. But we did navigate that. And since then we've presented together, once when we were still colleague, client, therapist, all of that stuff. And then Sarah left that agency and then eventually left the state because she hates me. Just kidding. And so our work together as client therapists came to an end. And then Sarah and I, we're still navigating this relationship as like former client, former therapist, still colleagues, and really over the years have grown into friends. I think our clinical relationship ended in 2019, maybe earlier. I'm not 2018, not really sure. Pre-pandemic. I know that 100% should be true. And so in the past 4 or 5 years, we've really just developed into colleagues and friends and love to work together professionally and love to see each other on a friend basis whenever possible. And I would say that's kind of, where we're at in our story right now.
Yeah, it's definitely been an evolution, and one that has not, for me personally, been mirrored in really any other relationships. It's been a very unique journey of, as you shared, Jamie, sort of moving through different layers of different types of relationships, having to do a lot of ethical discussions and conversations throughout that process to navigate and sort of co-create how we're going to navigate this path together, where all of a sudden your professional life overlapped with mine and with the setting where you were receiving services, and then moving beyond that to where we're both now colleagues and have done a number of projects together through that organization, through other organizations. So definitely a winding road, but one that is interesting and fits nicely with, I think, the topic we're going to talk about today, which really focuses on fluidity and flexibility and a way to navigate trauma work in a way that looks a little bit different from just a traditional 50-minute sit on a couch kind of therapy session. So I kind of love that about the way that we, as we get into our stuff today, I think that'll kind of show the way that we kind of navigate this stuff together is pretty unique, and I like it.
Yeah. And it's been equally unique. I haven't seen as many therapists as Sarah's seen clients, I'm sure, but I haven't developed a relationship quite like this with anyone else I've seen for therapeutic services. So it is really unique, and yeah, it's been a little gift to me. So I want to talk a little bit about the work Sarah and I did together clinically. And in one of the first sessions I had with Sarah, she encouraged me to get a book or a diary or something to hold all the work that we did together. And she really wanted me to, and Sarah, you might be able to, come in here a little bit too. For me, what I took from it was we were going to spend time together and do this therapeutic work, but then I should, on my own, outside of that therapy session, also utilizing creative expression, do some of my own work. And that really became a big part of our rhythm of therapy. Was we would explore different themes. I would do some sort of creative practice around it. I would bring it in. We would talk about that. It would lead into other themes. And I ended up calling this book my trauma journal. And so for me, it meant a lot. And I found having something that gave me space to be intentional about, well, what did we talk about? Like, what do I need to process? Like, what does this look like? You know, being able to go back and look at it with Sarah. It really informed. Sarah was the first person I really saw as a therapist outside of that, like, very brief negative experience. And it's really informed what healing has looked like for me ongoing. And it's continued throughout, even without seeing Sarah as a therapist or even necessarily working with people who are like, you should have a trauma journal, or anything. So I think we'll, unless you want to add anything else, kind of move over to the mental health perspective, and why you have clients do something like this.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think I make people do this, but I might encourage people to do
Did
this.
I say make? I didn't mean make.
No, I think it's a nice segue because you're right, Jamie. You know, as a therapist, I am always acutely aware of the fact that I see you maybe for 45 minutes a week if you're coming in for weekly sessions. Often people come in for every other week. In some models, those sessions are even briefer, depending on the setting where you work. You may only have a 20 or a 30-minute session with some folks. So the idea, I had a supervisor once long ago who I forget what the number was, but he multiplied out the math, right? Like how many minutes per day, how many days per week, this massive number, like, you spend X many, thousands of minutes outside of therapy and you spend 40 here. And that ratio is heavily skewed. So the idea that you're just going to come into this office and do work for an hour a week is great. And in addition to that, it's important to know that some of this work is going to be translated back home. And how do you move through your real world and develop skills and process information in a new and different way that takes practice, that takes coaching and checking in and kind of doing stuff in real life and then bringing it back into the therapy room to talk about it and navigate it and maybe develop a different plan and go out and try that again the following week. So it's a very dynamic and fluid process for me in the way that I do the work. And I think that having something tangible is a big piece of that and is really helpful for making that concrete. Because coming into therapy often for a lot of people is very abstract. Like I'm just going to go in and talk about thoughts and feelings and it's kind of like up here in the clouds, but to really bring it down into something that I can physically hold in my hand can be very centering. It can help you to feel like there's something concrete to look at and show something tangible that represents that process. So in therapy, a lot of times we talk about content versus process. The content is the actual stuff you're talking about, but the process is everything else. It's how you approach the task. It's all of the emotions that come along with it. It's how it feels to be in relationship with people, whether that's your therapist or out in real life. So a trauma journal is a very helpful tool to navigate that gap between the abstract nature of the work and the concrete nature of what makes it easier to grab onto something. So I, as a therapist, as a psychologist, I was trained pretty heavily in my early years in cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, so CBT, DBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, all of which are great models, all of which have a ton of research support to back them in terms of being an evidence-based practice. And it really wasn't until I got out into kind of the real world of doing this work for a while that I found ways to get a little more creative, I guess, a way to branch out to keep that backbone and that center of evidence-based treatments that we know work and that are helpful, and to add into that and to mix into that some fluidity and flexibility that can be helpful, especially I find in trauma work. And what we know about trauma is that trauma is not linear. People who have experienced, particularly people who have experienced repeated complex compound trauma, there's not this like timeline. There's not this like story that's like you read the book and A and then B and then C and then D. That's just not the way that the nervous system and that the brain processes and retains those memories. So when people sometimes are asked to tell their story or to share elements of their trauma history, it can actually be very triggering for them because they don't remember or know it in that way to say a story that's very linear. There may be flashbulbs of snapshots of images. There may just be feelings inside that they don't really have a specific story to map onto it, but there's just stuff in there that they know they carry. That can be particularly true for folks who experienced childhood trauma. And some of those early memories may not be sort of cemented in the same way that older memories are, or that memories for older people are. So there's a lot of moving parts when you start to dissect how are we going to tackle trauma. Different people process information differently. Some people are very verbal. Other people, verbal is not their best modality. So some people really benefit from talking through with words. Other people feel pretty overwhelmed by that idea. And for them, something visual or artistic may be a really good fit. So I guess from a mental health perspective, that's where I kind of bring in these different lenses and different layers of how can we do things that are informed by research, that are evidence-based. How can we do things that will help different kinds of people who process information in different ways, internally versus externally, visually versus verbally? How do we bring in all these different styles and approaches and package that in a way that feels accessible? And so the different forms of, or some of the different forms we're going to talk about today with artistic expression are a really nice way to bridge that gap, to have some verbal components, some visual components, to bring in pieces of memories that you may want to talk about with a therapist, right? But also some things that may not be so easy to grab onto. It may not be a specific memory, but it may be pieces of your trauma that you still carry.
Thank you, Sarah. I like know all this stuff, but it's like good to like rehear it, and it like reminds me too about like implicit memories too, and some of the stuff that happens with post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress symptoms if someone's like undiagnosed, where someone could feel something in their body, feel it in their heads, but not be able to like pinpoint like what is this thing that I need to process, and having some of those more like abstract and less narrative based things that need to be worked through and processed and overcome and integrated. So thanks so much. I wanted to talk a little bit about the process of authentication. And like the dictionary just says it's the process or action of providing or showing something to be true, genuine, or valid. So for me, the process of trauma journaling and still is this way for me to take power back. In some ways, I feel like through so much of my experience, how I felt about things, how I experienced things, the actual facts of what happened to me were disputed. They weren't believed, they weren't validated, they weren't seen as something that was worthy of caring about. If anything, it was like the opposite. Other people were like putting other narratives onto me, which weren't like factually, like objectively true or like subjectively true. So just a lot of projection. So authentication for me is, for one, like going into a therapy room and like being able just to share how I experienced something, without it being disbelieved, with just going into a space where it's like safe and knowing that what I say will be accepted. And then taking that work and, that 45 minutes to an hour, that I'm spending with this therapist, and, diving into that like deeper, like trying to figure out that out more. And then for myself, like authenticating that experience, or like that experience, that feeling, like that was true. And also like taking some of those like projections too of, no, these things that people said about me, these things that people like, just overall stigma, these things are not true. And so, you know, just being able to do that for myself, and then bringing that back to a therapist, and then being able to get that like external validation as well. So just throughout my process, authentication has been like important. It's not just about like remembering, but it's about like unlearning some of the memories, and like meaning making, and like figuring out how I really feel without like the noise of, what abusers were telling me and what like society was like telling me. Um, and then, even further, anyone who's been in like therapy, or um, even non-traditional like healing modalities, or like healing modalities that are kind of just done with yourself, like understands like it's a long process. When you're recovering from complex, compound, chronic trauma, it's not just something you go to like 6 sessions and then you're done. Um, and it's not like, well, you go for like 2 years and then you're done. Like it's a lifelong like process of going in and out of these things and figuring out new ways of approaching it, and all of that stuff. And for me, just even having a record of the process, because therapists take their notes and they have a record of your process, but if you're not doing anything outside of those sessions, it's just almost like, oh, well, I can like forget like where I've come from and how much I've like grown and like involved. But like having this like tangible thing, I can go back and look to see like how much progress I've made. And sometimes having like dark hours, it's really good to have this like tangible thing to be like, whoa, wait, like for one, I've like overcome all of this stuff. And for two, I've put so much time and energy into overcoming it, and I've grown and evolved, and like in spite of all I've been through, like I'm resilient and I'm like here. So for me, trauma journaling is a way to, for one, authenticate like my experiences and my feelings, and then it's also there to authenticate the process, and for me to have something to take away. And I still do have my trauma journal, something I still look through, and I'm happy it exists. So
Yeah, I love the distinction you made too. I think it's really beautiful to think about the difference between authentication and validation. So you can get external validation from others, whether that's a therapist or a family or a friend, and that's incredibly valuable. And I'm not minimizing that in any way, but I think the trauma journal is really unique in the way that it allows self authentication. This is something that's deeply personal that you are creating, and that you do have that tangible reminder in your hand that you can over the years flip back through and return to time and time again to see that journey, and to remind yourself of all the work that you've done. I mean, as you said, right, but that authentication and that showing to yourself is something that is so much more valuable than any external validation that you can get. So I think that's just a really important distinction here. And I just wanted to pause on it one more time because you said it so beautifully. And I wanted to just make sure that that sticks, this idea, the idea that the trauma journaling really is about you going through a process, regardless of what that finished content looks like. It's not about being like the next Picasso. It's about that process. So for you to authenticate and to show yourself the things that are true and genuine and valid. It's great that you can bring that into therapy or show that to loved ones and feel validated externally, but that internal thing is what you really hold on to.
Yeah. I feel like I've brought this up a lot of trainings, and I read this book I feel like several years ago now. But Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning. And he's a Holocaust survivor who was also, and forgive me, either a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Can't really tell you. I'm not 100% sure. So one or the other. And he was that before the Holocaust. And he had this idea that to overcome hardships, you had to be able to make meaning out of it and find purpose in it. And then he was sent to a concentration camp, and he had to put that theory literally to test, and he watched it, he observed it. He said there were so many people who were just holding off for Christmas. They were barely hanging on, but for some reason in their minds, they thought this is going to end at Christmas. And if I can just make it to Christmas, then I can make it out of this. And he watched the people who had that belief and thought make it to Christmas. And then when that was over, they unfortunately passed. And then even for himself, his meaning and purpose was to see his wife and his family again. And unfortunately, after he experienced all of that, he found out his wife didn't make it. But what was different for him is he found ways to make new meaning and make new purpose. And I say all of that to say the process of healing and the process of surviving is really this idea of making meaning out of what you've been through, what you're currently going through, and what you're moving towards. And those things have to be rooted in things that feel true, that feel genuine, and that feel valid to you. And creative expression is a great way to figure all of that out. So that's Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning. He founded logos therapy, which is, I'm sure I didn't do it any justice, but the concept I just talked about. So. All right, hard left turn into Dadaism. So through the rest of the presentation, we'll be talking a little bit more about art and creativity, be looking at examples, and so on and so forth. So one thing that I wanted to talk about was you do not have to be an artist to get a trauma journal, to engage in creative expression, to do a trauma journal that has art or poetry. And a lot of that is by using techniques and stylism and ideas that were created during the Dada movement. So Dadaism is an avant-garde art movement that began in Europe in the early 20th century. The movement was a reaction to the horrors of war in the rationalized, mechanicized society that many believed had brought about the war. And so Dada artists, poets, and writers were known for their unconventional and often nonsensical approach to art. They rejected traditional artist conventions and embraced chaos and randomness. Dada works often include collage, assemblage, and ready-made objects. And they challenge the notion of art as something carefully crafted. Dada art is often characterized by humor, whimsy, artistic freedom, emotional reaction, irrationalism, and spontaneity. And so I think for a lot of people, when they think about art, they might think of the Mona Lisa, which Da Vinci worked on for decades. Like that wasn't something he did just in like one sitting. Like he carried this like scroll around with him for so long and like worked and tweaked, and it was very methodical. And there was a lot of precision in what he did, where with try, and you can bring that into trauma journal, like no shade to precision or, you know, being methodical. But for me, I found bringing in collage and assemblage, and ready-made objects, which we'll talk a little bit about, like how to incorporate ready-made objects, which is just like things you find around your house, um, really were helpful for me, especially, you know, being a person who's working a full-time job, trying to heal from trauma and having all these other like commitments in my life. I didn't have like, you know, days upon days to like sit there with um all that work I did in therapy and then process it, you know, for however long I needed. Um, you know, all the things I did in my trauma journal were things that I definitely, excuse me, just one moment. I do apologize.
While Jamie's handling that, I'll just add, I think a really key part of this lens is also the idea that you don't have to be an artist, you know, and what does that even mean? You know, I think so often, as kids, we may be told that, you know, art is supposed to look a certain way, or, you know, we see the Mona Lisa and we think, well, I can't ever create that. And so our creativity gets stifled, you know, like we get pushed down and boxed into this idea that we can't create things because we're just not artistic enough. But the beauty of this approach is that it really challenges that notion, right? It challenges the idea that it has to be this like perfect thing that looks a certain way. This is all about process. It's all about creating for the sake of creating. And particularly with a trauma journal, you may never show this art to anyone. So you don't have to apologize to anybody. You're going to make what is on your heart to make. You're going to create stuff that maybe, you know, 6 months later, you flip back and look at it and you remember the emotional space you were in. You remember what it represents. You don't dissect it and say, well, gosh, like the angle of that Mona Lisa's nose is a little off. I feel like the shading didn't really, like, that's not what this is about. So this idea of making it more accessible and taking off that weight of other people's expectations. There's no grade, right? No, there's no art teacher who's going to come in and give you a B- for this assignment. This is all about what you need to do within yourself.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. Anyone else have kids home from school today? All right. So that's Dadaism. And Sarah, I'm actually going to skip the first slide and go to the next one, and then I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I think that's what's going to work best. All right.
Curveball, call an audible.
So I'm going to show, I have two examples from my actual trauma journal that I'm going to share with you all today. And they're just like little snippets, because the intent of my trauma journal wasn't to share it widely and openly, right? So the first one, oh, that's the process. I'm skipping a couple slides. And then we'll go back to the process. So this is something I created in my trauma journal, and Sarah and I were just talking about the theme of sex. And you know, what I found interesting looking back at this, you know, so many years later and like a different knowledge base, is what shows up in this example is the painting by Pablo Picasso, Guernica. I swear I just pronounced it Gurnovic. I'm gonna look it up real quick. You guys are a lovely audience. Guernica, there we go. So Guernica shows up in this, and I don't know if you guys can see, but this is from Guernica. This is from Guernica. And it's this painting that Pablo Picasso did in response to the war. And it's very cathartic, you know, imagery. And so it allowed me to conceptually and to reach back into historic and transcendent like resources to say how I felt about sex at that time in my life. And to me, it's very interesting to look back and see, like, to have the context of like what this painting was and to see how it ended up in my trauma journal, and to be like, yes, 100%, exactly, that's 100% how I felt at that time, is really validating, like self-validating for me, you know, today. And also for me to be like, and I don't feel that same way, but like I know that there was a version of me that did, and like here it is, and I can like honor and respect that, and also appreciate the like wisdom, you know, that I had to like see these as I'm choosing the images that are going to be here. um so
Yeah, and I think that's a really beautiful point as well, that you're not going to be in the same space, you know. Well, hopefully you're not going to be in the same place. Hopefully you're learning and growing and evolving as a person, not just about trauma, but about everything in your life, right? So to look back at something you created months or years earlier, it should feel like you're in a different space. And I think sometimes, going back to that art critic kind of thing, you know, we get in our heads about like, oh, well, gosh, this isn't going to be perfect. Or, you know, if I look back on it, am I going to judge myself for it? That's really antithetical to this process of creation. So shifting that lens to more of a growth focused model of saying, wow, where was I here? Where am I now? How did the creation of this help me to move the needle? You know, I think those are really powerful components of art-based work. And then also, Jamie, you mentioned the idea of transcendence, which I think is huge. There's a universality to art. So we, you know, can today in 2023 look at an artwork that was created in the 1700s, in the 1800s, whenever, you know, we can look back historically and know there was a historical context, there was a socio-political context, there were things about this art back when it was created, and then use that to inform the art that you're creating, you know. So pulling in a piece from Picasso and feeling the energy of that, even though the topic of your topic versus, you know, his topic and theme of war when it was created might be very different, but maybe those themes are universal human experiences that we all share.
yeah. Thank you, Sarah. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about this example from my trauma journal, and like what this process was. And so this is just like a map that I found. And essentially, like the process for me was like, all right, like let's do exposure therapy, but like let's start somewhere like smaller. Like, and the first thing I did was like go to like Google Earth. Like, let me look back at this place, um, like on the internet, safely at home. Like that was like the first level of like exposure, and something, you know, unexpected happened in that. And I found out like this particular like structure that I was like looking for. I was like, it's gone. It's gone. It's not there anymore. There's a house, like a nice new looking house here. And like interesting. But Google Earth has this like function where you can like go back in time. And I was like, no, I still want to see like the thing though. I still want to see it. So I like went back in time and like I found it. So the picture of the actual place is like as it was, like when it was meaningful to me in a negative way, negatively meaningful, you know, is in the trauma journal. It's not included in this example. Um, you know, but that was like the first layer of exposure, and like bringing this to, and Sarah and I had talked, there was like this area, I'm like, and because the work I was doing really specifically, you know, I was like, I need to feel okay about going into this area because we have a potential client who lives here and I have trauma associated with this like area. And so, you know, the process was like going online, like doing this research, like getting this map, creating art. And then Sarah and I, at a later time, ended up driving out to this location, you know, and I got the opportunity to like take a picture of like what it looks like now. You know, and feeling safe with like Sarah there and like going through all this exposure. So just like trauma journals, at least for me, are very mixed media. And it also made it so like the therapeutic work was also like mixed modalities, and different approaches. So
Yeah. And exposure therapy at its core is a huge piece of trauma focused CBT, or other types of CBT for other types of really anything that provokes anxiety. So, any type of anxiety or trauma, it's very natural and normal for us to want to avoid the trigger. It just makes sense, right? If there's something that's triggering, that's bringing up lots of really difficult to manage emotions, then if we avoid that thing, then that becomes sort of a band-aid that in the moment we don't have to, confront the horror of whatever that thing is. Obviously, over time, that can become counterproductive, especially if there are reasons why you need to go to a location or, interact with things that are triggering. The idea of exposure therapy is rooted in a lot of different therapeutic practices. In this case, we were able to integrate art and trauma journaling with it as part of the sort of the hierarchy. So rather than just diving straight into doing the most intense, most anxiety provoking thing we could imagine, starting off with something that felt more manageable and then working our way up from maps to visual imagery that was integrated into the work to actually physically in person seeing things. So just a really nice example, though, I think, in terms of the trauma journaling and the art, of ways to bring in, like you said, mixed media, to bring in household objects. This particular exposure therapy was around a location, but there are lots of things that are triggering, and so bringing in imagery or pictures or items that kind of bring or elicit some of that reaction would be a great first step towards that hierarchy of exposure.
And because it's trauma journal, like I have this memory of like how I worked through this, and it's definitely interesting too, because I like thinking about like my behaviors and like habits today, because I still live in the same city, and about how part of my coping strategies is I just avoid certain places because I can, and I have like no reason to go to certain places. And if it takes me like 5 minutes longer to go somewhere, then that's like fine. And I feel like I decided that's like good. And so I do also just want to say like exposure therapy is great when you have like a reason to like manage and like navigate like a trigger associated with a place or thing, but also if it's just avoidable, like within reason, that's cool too. Like that's my current strategy. I'm not doing any exposure therapy on like any other parts of the city I live in, because I'm just like, no, most things are like avoidable. And if um, I guess in like most major cities, I was like, I can just go to a different location and it's not that much of a challenge. So just wanted to externally validate doing exposure therapy, but also avoidance is great too. And Sarah was also one of the people who was just like, yeah, if you can avoid things and you don't have a place to go to them or a reason to be there, then that's like cool too. Um, so I did this actually this week, and so I wanted to show the process. I did a little time lapse. And so I like just wrote like free wrote something, got a magazine, selected a couple images out of it. I have a Nat Geo subscription because I think they have beautiful, beautiful images for this process. I rewrote the poem. I like tidied it up when I wrote it out on a sheet of paper. And then I used these strips of, and it may be difficult to see in these pictures, but these strips of like a beautiful like mountain scene, and then like a building collapsed and there's like smoke, and I'm not really sure what the other one is, but it's like dark. And so this contrast between like something beautiful and like something like destructive, and wrote this poem. And so this is like an example of what the process looks like for me now. And I currently don't have like, a therapist who's like, we're checking in on this trauma journal, but this is still something that's like integrated into my life. So this is what the actual process is. And this didn't take a ton of time. This was between 45 minutes and an hour, to do this. So it was a manageable amount of time for me. So I did want to show you guys the process.
To add to that too.
Oh,
Sorry, do you mind if I add one thing on there? So just one thing that this particular example of art and poetry reminds me of is also the idea of the directionality of how creativity and expression can flow. So for some people, especially people who naturally gravitate towards more verbal modalities, or people for whom poetry feels very accessible, they might feel very comfortable to sit down and write a poem and then locate images that sort of connect to that in some way and do an exercise, something like this. For other people, it may be the other direction, where maybe they are flipping through a magazine and locating images that elicit some sort of an emotion. And then maybe using that imagery to fuel whatever, words, or and it may not be a verse kind of a poem. It might just be words, maybe collaged on there in some other way. So I think the inspiration and the flow for this can move in a lot of different directions, I guess.
thank you for that, Sarah. I have done both of those things, and I have done just kind of like random words as well. So thanks. I like put this as the process, but this is just an example of a process that I used this particular time, but there are many different approaches. So thank you.
Yeah.
So based on time, we're going to go through just a few more examples. And I'll go ahead and read these. I think this one, and Sarah, when you and I met to do our pre-SurvivorCircle planning, one thing that you said about this one was how you liked how illuminated that, like, all trauma journaling isn't like dark. So there's ways to like celebrate good things in trauma journaling as well. And so this example says, I am light, curiosity, and moxie, someone striving to know myself, to know gratitude, to know empathy. My truth is found in golden hours and the countless stars of a dark night, in the fragrant bloom of roses. My power is in connection, community, relationships. I am passionate about love and justice and mercy and kindness, all the things that make each moment sacred. Like a passion flower, my purpose blooms, leaving onlookers intrigued. My passion writes an interesting story for others to read. So this can be about processing and working through difficult emotions, but it can also be about, that like common theme I hear from a lot of survivors, and I've experienced, is like, I don't know who I am. And it's just like, oh no, this is who I am. So
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful example of the beauty of healing and gratitude and knowing yourself, all of those things, right? And so I do love the idea that, if someone is thinking about tackling some of this on your own and you're not partnering with a therapist, it can feel like, especially because, like you titled yours a trauma journal, it almost suggests by the name that everything in it is going to be all about trauma. Everything in there is going to be like rehashing the stories of all of the terrible things that have happened to us in our lives, when in reality, so much of healing is based on growth and light. And so this is just such a beautiful work that shows a different lens, which I like.
and I included this example because it's haiku, and this one actually isn't from my trauma journal, or wasn't even related to any sort of like healing practice, other than like taking time for self-care and doing art and doing things you enjoy is healing and good for you. But this one really is about how you can bring in like structured poetry. I'm not a poet, so I don't really know like the terms, but a haiku is a way of doing poetry. It has a structure. It's like 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. And so having that like foundation can be helpful, or having like prompts can be helpful. You don't have to necessarily do this all on your own. There's lots of stuff online. There's so much media out there that can really like help structure what you're going to do. And so I'm a Floridian. And so this one says, springtime in Florida brings cool breezes and songbirds. The heat comes too soon. Sarah knows too.
Oh yeah, as a former Floridian, I know. Yeah, I love, so the haiku is one example. There are lots of other examples of sort of structured or scripted ways to approach poetry so that it's not just a big giant blank page. I actually love, and I don't know what this original piece of art looked like, but at least how it's shown here, it looks like a very small piece of paper, right? Sometimes even just changing what we're doing, if we have a little index card and we create art onto that versus having this big giant like legal pad with all the lines that I have to fill up, just freeing your mind and visually bringing in different textures of paper, or different, crayons versus markers versus paints versus a pen versus a Sharpie. It's interesting to see how the different modalities end up inspiring you to move in different directions. The weight of a pen in your hand can make a difference in how it feels. I mean, everybody loves a good pen, like, like if you feel that energy, or the boldness of a Sharpie, a black Sharpie, where you're, drawing heavily with that, can be very expressive. So yeah, that's my observation on that one.
Sarah, thank you so much. You're picking up on all these like nuances that like are all up here, but you're really like drawing them out, and I appreciate that. And this is on a pretty small format, and that definitely has been part of the process, is using different. I've almost never just had like line sheets, like notebook paper. It's been really helpful to use things with different textures to almost set the mood for the work, and to get my head in a different space with it. I've also had the opportunity, and because of time, I'm going to skip through these pretty quickly, to do some like nature-based, so like out in the wilderness, no cell service, backcountry type of stuff, where you do some like art around the beauty of like where you're at, but then also like processing some, emotions through like art therapy. And we'll just skip over these due to time. This was like another creation that I made like in the wilderness. And this one was kind of like an activity where you're like finding like what colors and like what visuals feel like your body, like where do colors and textures live in your body. It's a fun one. And so I'll ask Becky, have we had people engaged in the chat? Do we have a few participants, or do people like to create their own 6-word memoir today?
Nice. We don't have any comments at the moment, but of course, folks feel free to comment. Ooh, a 6-word memoir. I like that.
These are really cool. I mean, it's kind of like the haiku as well. It just gives you a very brief and very structured approach, right? So it's like I gotta just get a few syllables out, or I've just got to get 6 words out. So it's kind of a fun and interesting twist if people feel comfortable and want to attempt to write something, or if you would like to share it in the chat, you're obviously welcome to. If it's something that you just want to write for yourself in your home or wherever you are right now listening, but the idea of, how would I tell my whole life story? How would I tell some piece of this memoir about who I am, or about what I stand for, or about something that's meaningful or important to me? How would I sum it all up in 6 words?
And I provided a couple examples, none of which I wrote. I'll be transparent. This top one is, I think, a great one that someone I know did write. It's sink or swim. I grew fins. Another one is true resilience takes on many meanings. And these I just like found online. I thought that one was great. And I don't have any experience with adopted, but my dad is adopted. And so this one resonated with me for that. because I still feel like part of my history is unknown, like that generational thing, but it's like adopted new life, but unknown history. And so like the deck says, the slide says, just need a pen or paper. If you have a post-it note, I love doing these on post-it notes. So if you have that, you can do it there, but you can also just like write it out. And the only like rules is they use only 6 words and only use words that feel true, like to you. Um, and it couldn't be a 6 word like memoir for your entire life, but you can also make this 6 words to describe like a period of your life or a specific memory. So there's really not a whole lot of rules. You can make this work for you. So if we have anybody who wants to share, who did one and wants to share it, love to hear them. And if not, that's cool too. We can move on and anyone watching this in the recording, you can like pause it now and you can like write your little memoir before you continue on with the rest of the presentation.
Anchored and adrift, and that's okay. I love it.
Thank you, Becky.
Yeah, sorry, this is my jam, not to take away from anybody else, but writing is my jam. So I love this prompt.
All right. And so we're going to move on to the next. This won't be an activity we have time for today, but I did want to introduce you to the concept of blackout poetry. So it's a form of creative, and I'll let you know too, this is explicitly from Dadaism. This is like something that was created back in the early 20th century in Europe. And I'll show some examples of it. So blackout poetry is a form of creative expression where existing printed text, usually from newspapers, books, or other written materials, is selectively obscured or blacked out to create a new piece of poetry. It's a little bit like found poetry. The process involves redacting or covering up words and leaving only specific words visible to form a poem. In this one, too, the steps and materials are, you don't have to be someone who has like hundreds and hundreds of dollars of art supplies. You just need an old book, old newspaper, old magazine. Just gotta identify some words, and you can use like a pencil or a pen or like markers to like black out the rest. You can get super creative with it. It can be super basic, whatever works for you. Because of time, I'm not going to play this video, but it is a video that I am in. Just my hands are in it, but it is showing you the process for how to do blackout poetry. I will ask Becky to, or Sarah, do you have the link? Can you maybe pop it in the chat for people who want to reference this for later?
Yeah, I can dig that up, or also Becky, if you're able to share the link through the Survivor Space website, that may also be a way for folks who come and watch it later to kind of grab that too.
I'm just seeing if I
Yes,
can grab the
definitely.
link here. Yeah, I don't want you guys have to like search for it. If you want to learn blackout poetry from someone other than me, though, you can just go to YouTube and look for blackout poetry lesson. Maybe this one will pop up, probably not, but but we'll send out the link. So here's some examples of blackout poetry that I've done. And this one says relationships, environmental factors, social class, antisocial behavior, justice system, rehabilitation, recovery. So it kind of covers some like darker themes and it ends on hope, which is nice. Not all of my stuff ends hopeful. So and this is another example. And this one I did while leading a blackout poetry workshop. And we were all doing it together. And this one's like a little bit more abstract, but it says rain the next morning, rain. I love it. Shaking. I feel everything. Yells, angry, grumbles. Interesting experience. Perceive it, the rain, thoughts, feeling everything. that'll be the end of this presentation. I really appreciate everyone being here. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything they would like to share? No big deal if you don't. Okay, give it a minute before we move on. I'm also going to pull up that YouTube link for you guys.
The mute button that gets us all. Thank you both for that great presentation. I love all the creativity in this. You know, and I know for me, when I've thought about trauma journaling in the past, it's always just been words. It never occurred to me to have like the Google map and the blackout poetry. Those are such awesome ways of expressing.
You know that I use AI in Adobe Express to make literally any image.
Oh. So yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. And I know we're at 4 o'clock, so I want to honor everyone's time. If anyone you know, has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us on Survivor Space. I will put my email address here in the chat, and that way folks can follow up with any questions. And I also wanted to let you know that you know, the recording of this will be available on the SurvivorCircle's page, where you found the registration link for today's session. So if you'd like to see the recording, feel free to visit the page. We'll get it up on YouTube as well. And our next session will be next Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Kaisa K will be giving a presentation about poetry, and she will have a guest presenter who is a published poet with her. So if that's of interest to you, we hope you'll join us then. But thank you all so much for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.
I would sorry, I want to interject real quick. I want to give a shout out to Kaisa K. I did watch her Survivor Circle, and I was like, oh, I was really inspired by it, and I was like, I want to share like my knowledge of like art and all that stuff. So shout out to her for inspiring this Survivor Circle. So really appreciate her. And appreciate everyone who attended, is going to watch the recording. Appreciate you, Becky, and of course I appreciate you, Sarah.
Thank you all.